Why are summers at the Shalom Hartman Institute so special?
Because that's when Jewish leaders and learners like you and me travel to Jerusalem to wrestle with big ideas and study with Hartman's inspiring faculty.
The Shalom Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people.
Our scholars draw on 3,000 years of Jewish wisdom to develop the ideas we need to face today's challenges.
This summer, the pandemic has prevented us from traveling, but it doesn't prevent us from learning together. Welcome.
Join hundreds of Jewish leaders for All Together Now, a month-long celebration of ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute. From now until July the 23rd, come learn with us in this moment of crisis and opportunity.
Hi, everyone. Hello and welcome to the first of 3 conversations on Blackness, Jewishness, and America, Opening a Conversation. This learning session is part of All Together Now Jewish Ideas for this Moment from the Shalom Hartman Institute. We are a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. My name is David Zvi Kalman, and I'm going to be helping out behind the scenes. And here's just a few things you need to know before Ginna Green and Justus Baird start teaching. We are going to be taking questions throughout the session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature and we'll respond to it. The panelists will respond to it after they finish speaking. This session is also going to be recorded, and the recording should be available on the session webpage within 24 to 48 hours. Now let me introduce our speakers. Ginna Green is a political strategist, writer, and consultant, and until June 2020, the Chief Strategy Officer at Bend the Arc Jewish Action. She has been Managing Director of the Democracy Collaborative at Rethink Media, worked at the Center for Responsible Lending, including during the Great Recession and foreclosure crisis, and worked to pass the California Homeowner Bill of Rights and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. She has also worked for Full Court Press Communications, the Op-Ed Project, the Spin Academy, and the South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center. She has been published in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Salon, among others. Rabbi Justus Baird is Senior Vice President, National Programs at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Prior to joining Hartman, Justus was the Dean of Auburn Seminary. He was ordained at HUC-JAR and is an alumnus of both the Wexner Graduate Fellowship and the Hartman Rabbinic Leadership Initiative. So without further ado, Ginna and Justus.
Okay, thank you, David Zvi, for opening this up for that introduction. And Ginna, let me just say, I am super excited to be starting this conversation with you, to be doing this series with you. It's really a chance for me to grow in my own work in this area, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And we have over 200 people who've joined us today for this conversation, so I think it's a conversation that others are, interested in, committed to as well. Let me start by just saying a brief word about the series itself, and then I'll say just a word about why the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America is in this work, and then we're going to start with the conversation that we want to have today, which is a little bit more, this first one is going to be a little bit more personal, bringing in your story, Ginna, my story, Ginna, both at the personal and professional level. And really the goal of today's conversation is to open things up, to introduce some of the ideas that we want. In the second session, so these are going to be every Wednesday this week, and then for 2 more weeks or 3 more weeks, depending on your professional background. In the second session, we want to take a look at some moments in the last 100 years of Black-Jewish relations, especially in the US, and probably focus a little bit, we're going to bring in a historian of this period, focus a little bit on that civil rights period and trying to maybe reinterpret what was going on during that moment between Blacks and Jews, because it both reinforces but also tells a little bit of a different story than what many of us Jews hold on to as the legacy of that period. In the third session, 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk a little bit more about what might be going on in this particular moment. Why are so many people engaged in this movement at this moment? How are different Jewish communities thinking about what is going on, acting in terms of what's going on? And we'll hear from some activists and leaders who are in those spaces. And then for those of you who are Jewish professionals, Jewish educators, rabbis, we wanted to have a fourth session with you in a little bit more intimate environment to talk about kind of looking forward. What could an agenda for the Jewish community look like? So those are, that's a brief outline of what we hope to do in the series, and you're welcome to join for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of those sessions. Ginna, anything you want to add about that framing?
Not at all. It's perfect, Justus. Thank you.
Okay. So a quick word about the Shalom Hartman Institute and this particular conversation. So those of you who have studied with the Shalom Hartman Institute before may know that this has not been a major area of research or of teaching of the Machon, of the Institute, in recent years. And there are really kind of 2 origins for why we're starting to move in this direction. The first origin is our work with Muslim leaders, which we've been doing for more than 8 years now through a program called the Muslim Leadership Initiative. And some of the Black Muslim, African-American Muslim leaders that we worked with, as we really got into close relationship and learning together, said, you know, this religious difference thing, it's interesting, but what I really want to talk to you about. And we said, okay, that's not really our area of expertise yet. That's interesting, but we heard it and we started thinking about it. So that's one origin. It's talking with Black Muslim leaders in America whose experience is so unique compared to other Black American leaders in some ways. The second origin was in 2017, the Shalom Hartman Institute launched a really significant initiative to talk about American civics, to talk about Jewish values and American democracy in this moment. And the more we got into this conversations about civics, the more we sensed that you can't talk about democracy in America in this moment. You can't talk about civic responsibility in America in this moment without really engaging the question of race. So for those 2 origins, we started to sense that we needed to do some work in this area. And so over the course of about a year, we have been building some momentum. We are now actively planning a potential leadership program for Jewish Americans and Black Americans to do some studying and leadership together that will hopefully start in early 2021 when some of our COVID restrictions lessen up. And so that's just a signal to those of you out there who are interested in this work that we're trying to build some momentum. We're taking some baby steps at the Machon in this area. And this conversation series also is an important step in that direction. So that's just the opening words that I wanted to say. So Ginna, you and I said the way we wanted to launch this conversation was to speak a little bit more personally, include some of our own background and stories. Why don't you start us off and then I'll follow.
Great. Thank you, Justus. Thank you, David Svi. Thank you to Hartman for being responsive to the communities that you serve and the moment that we're in, and beginning this conversation today, as well as listening to the participants in the MLI, the Muslim Leadership Institute, as well as just taking note of this very truth that in America, we cannot actually separate out our democracy from the racist and racism and race implications that underpin everything that we do. I really appreciate that. And for me in particular, because I did democracy work for many years prior to coming to the New York Jewish Action and becoming a professional Jew, if you will. My own story is one of, when I go through a little bit of it, my own arc is one where I have lived a life as an adult with one foot really squarely in the Jewish community and another foot really squarely in the progressive community as well. And that has certainly colored, I think, the roles that I've taken and the work that I've done. And I'm really excited to be able to be in conversation with you, Justus, today, and with 301 other people who are also interested in this. So thank you. I'm Ginna Green, everybody. Hi. Thank you, WC, for that introduction. I did just leave the New York Jewish Action weeks ago. And in fact, my last day was the day before Shavuos, May 28th. And I cannot have imagined that I would leave the New York at this moment in America's history and at this flashpoint, because what it has allowed me to do is actually be open with conversation and with what I'm able to say and do and think and be for both the Jewish community and the movement. I am from South Carolina, born and raised. I am a Carolina girl, a native Southerner. That is a big part of my identity. I grew up on the coast between Charleston and Myrtle Beach in a little town called Georgetown. And I did not grow up Jewish. And I grew up in a community that was not only not Jewish, but decidedly Christian. And it was Black and it was white. And we were a small town. And growing up, as many Black children, I think, from all eras, have always been told you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. That was the mantra of my father growing up. And so I did work pretty hard and really internalized that thinking as a child of opportunity not being made available to me as readily available as it might be made for white people. That is certainly something that growing up in the South against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, and for me in particular with older siblings who are much older than I am, they're 12 and 14 years older than I am, they actually went to high schools that had been segregated just a few years before they went. And so my brother went to the high school that was the Black high school when segregation was still the law of the land, and my sister went to the high school that was the white high school. So I grew up with an internalizing of race, racism, and it was permeated in our very existence and living. And it's not untrue for the rest of America either. I think that what we have learned, particularly from so much scholarship and teaching and writing, really most notably and most recently for me was the 1619 Project. That project from the New York Times has really shed a lot of light on the role that race has played in our democracy from 1619 to now. But for me, growing up in the South, it wasn't a matter of if I would be the victim of some degree of racism, whether it was a microaggression or whether it was something more monumental. It was a matter of when, and we knew that would happen. Still, the South is home, and I'm actually back in South Carolina right now. After being in Connecticut for 2 years, I'm here for the summer, and it's been really remarkable for me to be going through this period of great transition. I just left a position at the New York. I'm on a new adventure professionally, and I'm back home, where even though there is still so much turmoil, we still are at this flashpoint, it feels comfortable for me. But when I left home, and this is where I'll get into a little bit of my Jewish journey, part of that Southern proximity, that living in the South and that proximity to the civil rights movement and all that we fought for in the Southern states was, as a Black child who wasn't Jewish, asking this question of, who are the white people that I'm seeing in these pictures documenting the civil rights movement, and learning about Heschel and learning about sort of the Jewish notion of pursuing justice and how infused it is into tradition and into faith. And that was really what brought me as a young adult to moving into learning and doing and being more with the Jewish community. I ultimately converted to Judaism as an adult in California, which is where I was at the time. I'm bounced around all over the place. And really for me, because I converted where I did, when I did, it created so much at that time of my life. I was instantly able to be sort of brought into community and lending my services and being involved and being a part of it. And as I grew in my Judaism and I had children, that is when I began to sort of see a little bit of a shift and think about the difference between the childhood that I'd had in South Carolina as someone who was not Jewish, and the childhood and the experiences that my children were now going to have. Children who were born Jewish, who had grown up in this faith tradition and have grown up in Jewish community. And I would say that there was one, in this particular moment, what has sort of an indictment of my own approach in sort of my own personal story has been, in the South, it is very common. It's a very common feature to see biracial children living with their Black grandparents, because the the white side of the family will not accept them, and they will be, and so there's like it's a known thing that in the Black community, white parent, white grandparent, you will be accepted. Like, it's a known thing. If you're good to go. If you're a biracial child, the Black folks, they'll always accept you. For me, having biracial, Black, white, and Jewish children, I made a conscious decision as an adult, as I'm growing my family, that I needed to make sure that their Jewishness, because of what I knew about the Black community and how Black folks accept all Black folks, whether or not they've got 2 Black parents or 1, that I needed to make their Jewishness unassailable. And I needed to invest in making sure that they felt comfortable, that they felt prepared for that racism, because like I told you, my father said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so over their lives and my adult life, both because I feel a tremendous affinity for and love for the Jewish community, and because I'm setting my children up for a better experience in Jewishness than most Jews of color get to have or experience, this work that we're talking about today, this conversation, and what that action will look like, both in shaping a Jewish community that's reflective of all of us, and also shaping the Jewish community's participation and work toward creating a larger world where we can all actually be free and thrive and live our best lives, is really what has brought me here today. And I'm really excited for this conversation and the next 3.
Okay, thank you, Ginna. That was a great start. So I'm so tempted to start engaging you in conversation, which we're going to do in a second. Let me also share a few personal words, and then we'll engage each other a little bit. I want to start with 2 short stories about 2 men who have shaped how I think about and experience race. The first is a story about my father. I grew up in Texas, not South Carolina, a different kind of South than South Carolina. You're the real South, I had Texas. And my dad was mostly not around because my parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. But I have a memory of a conversation with my father when I was probably in my early 30s. And he was living in Atlanta. I think we were at a Luby's cafeteria, for those of you who know what kind of restaurant that is. And my father liked to complain about, he died about 7 years ago. He had his own strong feelings about how the world should work, and he thought most people out there just didn't get it. And he understood like how the world should be, and if he could control the world, he would have loved to have done that. I remember him complaining about some local politics and local politicians, and at one point he made a reference to the Black community of Atlanta, kind of as an offhand. I don't know if he said those Blacks or what he said. But what I remember feeling is, I think that was kind of a racist comment, what he just said. And then the next thought was, well, my father couldn't be racist. I mean, how? Because he's my father, how could that be? And then I thought, well, if he had said those Jews, I would have definitely freaked out about that. So this was a moment for me when I think I started to connect the dots better about how the upbringing of my parents as white people in America, of myself as a person as white in America, that I was absorbing all kinds of signals and assumptions about race that were not conscious, but were definitely there. My father grew up in East Tennessee. I'm sure there were all kinds of things that he absorbed himself. So that's one quick story. The second one is a story about my boss when I worked at Auburn Seminary for a number of years. Auburn Seminary is a multi-faith institution that today is focused on supporting faith-rooted movements for social justice, including racial justice as a major area of work. And my boss was a Black Baptist preacher at the time. And when one of the more recent, when Ferguson started in 2014, I think, and one of the recent rounds of the movement for racial justice really started to gain energy and steam, my boss started talking about what it was like to be raising two Black teenage boys in Manhattan. Now, he had grown up in Massachusetts, in Worcester, which is to say he was around a lot of white folk growing up, and he was very comfortable there. But to watch him, this man who's extremely successful professionally, well off living in Manhattan, when he showed his fear about his own children and what was going to happen to them if they said the wrong thing to a police officer or someone else, really started to shape my own sense of how what I was experiencing was very different from what he and his family was experiencing in this moment. I mean, what happens to my kids with the police, I live in Princeton, New Jersey now. The police officers in my town stop my kids when they're riding their bike with their helmet to give them a coupon for a free ice cream. Okay, that's their experience with the police force. It is such a night and day difference, and it really started to shape how I was experiencing race. And so I feel like I'm on a journey myself at this point to try to understand it better, and to be working with others to understand it better, and to work not just to understand but also to act. Ginna, you and I met. I think we met did we first meet through a Wexner event on social justice? Was that right? We were both working professionally in social movement spaces at the time, and we've stayed in touch over the years. So let's engage in a little conversation for a moment. Can I start with a question for you? Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. So you mentioned your kids. You mentioned your childhood and your kids' experience. What reflections do you have about the similarities and differences, both because they're being raised in different religious environments, though not completely. I'm sure they're being raised in also knowing that they have family beyond the Jewish family as well. And they're being raised at different times. So how can you help us interpret this moment through the eyes of your own childhood understanding and the eyes of your own children, and what it's like to be a parent in this moment?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I've been reflecting on it more and more as America's been going through what we've been going through for the last few years, as well as as my children have aged. I have a 17-year-old boy, a 12-year-old girl, a 9-year-old boy, and a 5-year-old girl. So I've got quite the range of kids. And I was just having a conversation with Isaac, my eldest, a week ago, talking about precisely this. And I have been really feeling in some ways as if that focus that I referred to earlier, right? This idea that because I know my children will be accepted in the Black community, no matter what they do, no matter what they say, Blackness is not policed in the same way Jewishness is policed. And so I made an active decision to make sure that they were exposed and deeply participatory in Jewish school, in day school, in synagogue, in programming, so that they would be unassailably facile in living Jewish life. Because again, it isn't a matter of if.
Were you worried about? I'm sorry to interrupt. Were you worried about Jews? Were you worried about Black folk not thinking they're Jewish, or?
I was worried about white Jews questioning and interrogating their Jewishness, is what I was.
So you wanted to make sure that there was there was no questions.
Exactly, that they would be able to go to any event, any synagogue, any aspect of the Jewish community, and be able to be visible and present and participatory. And that would be one of the arrows in their quiver, because like I said, there was a policing of identity. And listen, I mean, I understand it. There is a lot about Judaism is about identity. It's throughout the Torah, right? Like, who is who? Who are we? Like, always asking these questions. And so I think there is like a generational and a traditional obsession is not the right word, but a focus on who is a Jew, who's Jewish, what identity is. And so I felt like I spent so much time and energy and resources in trying to make sure, like I said, that they were unassailably Jewish, that I think I actually spent less time on making sure that they felt unassailably Black. And so I, right now, as my children are aging and I'm watching them go through day school and I'm asking them, somewhat incredulously sometimes, I'm like, so really, you've never had someone in, Isaac and I were talking about this, he goes to SAR High School in Riverdale in the Bronx. And I was like, so really, you've never had a situation where someone has said, made a racist comment to you, or expected that you, or, questioned whether or not they would necessarily do this SAR because they would know, but like no one outside has questioned your Jewishness, asked you how you became Jewish. That's never, and it hasn't actually happened to him. But I know that is in some ways, is it because I have committed so much energy to making them comfortable and to making them able to be in Jewish space that actually my theory of change was right? Was I correct? Has what I've been doing for the last 17 years as a Black woman parent of biracial Jewish children made a difference? Because for their experience, for the most part, they feel like the Jewish community is theirs. But unfortunately, that is not a common experience. And I would also say that, I have to be honest as well, that like my own personal experience, both within the Jewish community and outside of it, is that I have managed to avoid some of the most traumatizing and problematic and challenging events and points in time that many of my Black friends and family have gone through. So I feel like I have had a good run, if you will, and my children have had a good run. But it's sort of like folks who are like, oh, America's post-racist because we elected Obama. Actually, no, Obama is the exception, not the rule, and we still have a lot of work to do. And my son, Isaac, said to me, he was like, well, isn't it kind of a good thing that I haven't experienced all the racism that you thought I would experience and that you thought I would have? And I said to him, it's good and bad. It's good because you haven't had to navigate that as a child, but it's bad to me because you don't have the tools to deal with it when it will happen, because it is going to happen. And I feel like growing up in the South, and this is not to say that the South has some sort of, claim to racism for sure, but it is different. And I think it imbues people who grow up there, especially Black people, with an extra layer of armor in how we deal and how we live and lead in the world. And he doesn't have that. And so I do still have this concern about how he's showing up in communities, and question sometimes my own decisions, but then also feel like, okay, what I thought turned out to be true.
Well, I don't think I've met a parent who doesn't question the choices we make about how we're raising our kids and the priorities we're making. But it sounds like this is a struggle for you. You make some big choices and you're wondering about how they will shape their experience in the Jewish community and the Black community in American society. So it sounds to me like they're doing pretty well.
So far, so good.
All right, let me ask you another question. This will be a little bit more of an, part of what we want to do with this conversation series is to get into the ideas, put them on the table that we need to be talking about. So many American Jews, many North American Jews who are perceived as white by everyone around them are, are entering this conversation, learning language like white privilege, white fragility, starting to understand that whether we accept or identify with the label of whiteness, that's how others see us. And not only that, but may have shaped all kinds of things that happened to us or to our parents or our grandparents along the way in North American society. I guess what I want to ask is, how do you think American Jews should be talking about or thinking about the concept of race, given that it's so deeply part of American society, it cannot be separated, and yet, right, so many American Jews are resistant to the idea that we are white. We didn't ask to be whatever. Like it's not. If we're given a list of, I can say personally, every time I'm given one of those check boxes, I don't really want to check the white box, even though I know I have to.
Such a great question. And being in a multiracial family with white Jews in my family who hold that, who actually also feel very deeply. I'm not white, I'm Jewish, right? And it's so deep, it's as deeply held sometimes for white Jews that they are not white as it is held in American society that we have all been racialized. And I think that it's really important that, I think the answer lies in a consciousness that race is a construct that is not only applied, but it also contains, right? It means that, Ashkenazi Jews, like you said, are deemed white by outside standards. Like there is a whiteness that gets applied, right? And then there's also this container that we as a Jewish community also sort of bring that in and create spaces that we perpetuate this in our own institutions. And so I think what's really important and what I think a lot about the work and the writing of Duff Kent, who is former executive director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and is now on staff at the New York. She does a lot of talking to fellow white Jews about what this means. And I think that there is recognizing that, I think the first step is recognizing that you can believe, like you said, what you believe about your own self and your own identity, and it almost doesn't matter in some ways because the outside world sees you as this. And because the outside world sees you as this, there is some privilege. There is some conditional influence and power that particularly white Jews have in this country in this moment, that they're afforded whether or not they see themselves as white or not. And I think really the first step is just understanding that and sitting with the discomfort of the fact that you have had that applied to you, and that you also exist within this container. And it's not easy at all. And I think that is the number one important thing that we can do to begin really the healing and the work of building the society where we can all do what we need to do to be.
Okay. Your turn.
Oh, so I get to ask Justus some questions. Exciting. Justus, you and I both come from movement spaces and backgrounds, and you are a rabbi, though. So you bring a different, you bring something different to movement space and conversations. And one of the things that I've noticed is that many rabbis, particularly rabbis who have congregations or they're in visible communal leadership positions, they're often afraid to, or reluctant, fear may not be the right application, but they're reluctant to be political at any point in time. And I'm really curious how you see that orientation in this moment of crisis, upheaval, and possibility in America.
Yeah, I actually do. I've had many conversations with rabbis and Jewish leaders of all types about, maybe I would frame it as what type of leadership is either going to be the most effective, or am I personally called to be, or does my community need in this moment? So I certainly don't think there's a one size fits all. One of the themes that's already come up in this summer program is the notion that when chaos and crisis strikes, we need to have a moral grounding that is or a values-based grounding that's holding us. Daniel Hartman, in his opening Beit Midrash, used the metaphor of a basketball metaphor of a pivot foot, the foot that stays grounded even though you're turning in every direction, and that's your moral grounding. So I think that there's some wisdom there in that idea and that metaphor. But at the end of the day, the hard work is actually practicing what I would call rabbinic leadership. I think it's actually not as simple as just being a rabbi, and everyone's answer will depend on what their vision for rabbinic leadership looks like in their context. For me, rabbinic leadership in this moment must include bringing people along in some form. You can do that with a prophetic model of leadership. You can do that with a pastoral model of leadership. You could probably even do it with a CEO model of leadership if you want to think of your, the institutional side of what you run. And as a rabbi, I interpret the world through our text and our tradition, and our stories have actually these different models of leadership, right? We have the prophets who mostly yelled into the wilderness and no one listened to them.
Yep.
I mean, we wrote down what they said, but nobody was following these people. And most true prophetic leadership is, all leadership is lonely. Prophetic leadership is really lonely. There are pastoral models, right, where you're constantly trying to be in touch with the community that sees you as their leader, that you feel like you serve, trying to understand where they are and helping them experience, process, and move beyond the loss. that is always accompanied with these kind of things, because we know that the first thing you learn as a rabbi when you do your pastoral work is that all change is loss, and so helping people process. So these are some options I think that rabbis have. For many years, I was mostly surrounded by the prophetic type of leadership, and there's no question that it is critical in our role. And I don't think that it's the only effective model. I really do think we have to have an ecosystem within the Jewish community of Jewish leaders broadly and clergy finding their authentic voice on these topics. So to make it more personal, right? I don't serve a congregation, at least not full time. I occasionally do some congregational work here and there. I have come to see my own leadership mostly in the form of an education role. It's just who I feel like who I am. Educational leadership is another option out there for what this looks like.
Thank you, Justus. I have another question. It might be in two parts. Getting a little bit more into this particular moment that we now have found ourselves in as a country these last several weeks. The Black Lives Matter movement has been a part of the American social landscape and globally. It's expanded beyond our borders, in fact. For 7 years this month, when Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida. Yet it wasn't until the murder of George Floyd last month in May that many non-Black Americans seemed to really grasp the severity of racial injustice in America, or the urgency with which so many Black Americans were approaching the issue, particularly of police killings and the underpinning white supremacy. What do you think is different about the current moment that has allowed for this awakening, particularly among white Americans and among white Americans, particularly white Jews? Because I have, this is funny, I have plenty of white friends, but most of my white friends are white Jews. And so I'm looking at it through this landscape. I know that for me, I've had so much love and support and outpouring from white Jews that it's different. Something is different right now. And I'm curious about what you think that is. And is this difference, is this heightened attention and interest sustainable for the period of time that we will actually need to make the change that would actually correct the wrongs of the last 400 years? That's part one. So we'll see what you say, and then maybe I'll give you part two.
Yeah, I think
we have to go to Q&A.
To some extent, I think this is a question that holds together the whole series that we're doing a little bit. So I think we'll keep talking about it. I don't feel like an expert analyst, so I feel a little bit more like in terms of my being, I'm a little bit more of where should we go than where we are in the moment. But let me offer a couple of thoughts. One is, I've been shaped by the movement theory teaching of a scholar named Beth Zemsky, who looks at social movements over time as arcs, the classic roller coaster, if you will, and that that moments influence. You can almost, you can't know it when you're in it, but in retrospect, you can start to see where moments line up on a movement arc. And my sense is that what's different today than when Trayvon Martin was killed, or when Ferguson lit up, or when Eric Garner was killed, is that we're a little bit farther along the movement arc, right? That so much work has been done in each of those moments that more and more people are unable to say, I don't think this is a one-off thing anymore. Maybe something is going on. And I don't have a great reason for why more people are willing to say, I'm curious about what I'm hearing, and I might even proactively like pursue reading or listening to some voice or some type of thinking that I wasn't usually in my thing, or I thought I kind of had all this figured out because I had a certain perspective, and maybe it's not exact, maybe that story's not quite right. So that's one answer. A second answer is there was a podcast episode of Code Switch a few weeks ago that asked the question about whether the pandemic and the coronavirus is an actual real factor in shaping how people are dealing with responding to this movement moment. And they had a sociologist expert on the episode, and she was somewhat convincing that there is something that happens when we feel the vulnerability that we feel right now as individuals and as a society, right? I think many of us, possibly depending on how old we are experiencing possibly the first or second time, like, oh, you mean society could all just crash and burn around us? That vulnerability, I think, opens up some spaces in other areas, and it's possible that that is also shaping it. Who really knows? But it could really be shaping things right now.
I have a follow-up question, which is, we've been in communication and conversation a fair amount in 2020 over a number of initiatives and things that we have done together. And since these last 4 weeks have happened, I posited that the Jewish community, because we are both part of the larger American fabric and distinct from it as well, we're within it and also outside of it and part of it, it means to me that we must fight this racial injustice in two ways. We actually have to be a part of addressing and looking inward at our own racism and how we have breathed the water of racism and white supremacy into our own institutions. But we also have to recognize that there is, even though we are a multiracial Jewish community, we are still a largely white Jewish community. And that largely white Jewish community, by virtue of being in America and that white privilege that comes with it, whether we want it or not, that there is some conditional power that the white Jewish community has right now, and by extension the Jewish community. And so we have some power that we can use to actually press levers of social change more broadly. So there's this internal work and there's this external work. I'm curious if you, A, agree with that assessment, and B, think that either one of those will be more or less challenging for us to recognize the need for and move into action to pursue.
I think it's a helpful analysis to frame Blackness, Jewishness in America, or Blacks and Jews in America, as having at least two parallel efforts or tracks, right? That one is to really work on the relationship between American Jews and Black Americans in this moment, and to think about that communal enterprise, and in parallel to do some intra-Jewish, introspective, not just reflection, but real struggling with how we become a welcoming community to all the full diversity of our community, to find an American expression of, I apologize for the background noise, my neighbor is literally having their yard worked on at the moment outside my window.
We can't hear it, Justus. It's louder for you than it is for us.
Okay, good. Makes me feel a little better. So this other track of, so whether one of them is going to be harder or not, I don't know. I do think there are major challenges to both, right? So many of us have a story in our head about the connection between Blacks and Jews that's rooted in a particular story or particular moment of the civil rights movement, a small slice of the story, and that was 70 years ago. It's harder for us to tell stories over the last 10 years of inspiring connections between American Jewish communities and Black American communities. There are some moments, and there are many other moments of that history, but when I talk with Black leaders about their relationship with Jewish communities, I hear openness and also a little reminder that, you know what, our house is burning. We have a lot of priorities, and the relationship with the Jewish community is not on our top 10 list right now. We're dealing with mass incarceration. We're dealing with voting rights. We're dealing with racism. We have a movement moment. We're dealing with socioeconomic. We have all these things. You know, if you want to join us on those things, okay.
That's the rub, right, Justus? I mean, that's the rub. The rub is that, like, okay, I'm interrupting, sorry, but I want to get this. That first, I think there is, like, we have to recognize that, like, the Jewish community has Black people in it, and Black people are Jews, and, like, vice versa, right? So I think we should just put that out there for everyone. Absolutely. That, like, even though we are talking about, you know, these two communities, that there's a Venn diagram, and there's some people who are in both and who live in both of those. But that's the thing, is that because there has been so much success of the white Jewish community in the United States, that we could actually harness our resources, our influence, and in some ways this conditional power that the white Jewish community has been able to amass over the last 100 years to really change America. Like, how different would it be if we redirected as a Jew, like if there was a redirection of significant resources and an interest and an investment in following the leadership of Black and brown-led groups who've been doing this fight against mass incarceration and against voting rights. And we actually took the steps to redistribute some of where we have invested. And I feel like that has been on the Jews for not being able to really say to communities, to Native communities, to Black communities, we are here and we can make this world better. I think about the quote from Lila Watson that says, you know, like, if you came here because you want to help me, you have wasted your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's get to work together. And I feel like that is what has been missing from that engagement and the lack of the stories that we've had that are newer than 70 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that's appropriate. Let me respond by trying to go a little deeper on this just for a moment, which is, and I'm gonna put my foot in it, I'm sure.
We're all friends here. It's all right.
That sense that, right, we're bound up together. I felt and experienced that sense among many Jews who, over the last 100 years, like you could read in the writings of folks who were funding the Tuskegee schools in the early 20th century for Black folks. You know, one of the primary funders, was the founder of Sears and Roebuck, and he just took his fortune, he's just like stuck it there, okay? It's amazing stories. You see that in the 40s and 50s during some of the civil rights movement. I think you're right to point out that there are spots where there's clearly this sense of shared work, and at the same time, and maybe it's always been like this, like I don't want to pretend that it's like an exceptional moment, but it doesn't feel at the general communal level that there's that same sense of shared destiny. That we American Jews on average, I think, have more to lose than we did a generation or two in American society. We have to confront that. I think I can only assume that subconsciously it shapes the choices we're making every day about how we are prioritizing our own efforts into this movement.
Yeah. I think, and I do know we're getting pinged to go to Q&A, but I want to touch upon that. I just want to continue the dig, if you will, in saying that, I mean, historically, we have seen a rise in white nationalism, which many people know is basically, it foundationally rests upon anti-Semitism. And what that means is, and so we have that bit of knowledge and data about where we are right now and where the white nationalist movement has come for the last 70 years as an outgrowth of, as a reaction to the success of the civil rights movement. And then we also know that historically, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest oppressions in the book. It predates white supremacy. White supremacy is only really about 1,000 years old, right? Started with the Crusades and like justifying colonialism and slavery. So anti-Semitism predates that. And historically, your point about we have more to lose now than we did a generation ago, I think is underscored by this notion and this historical fact that Jews are very rarely safe in many places for very, very long. And so there is, I think, a myopia that I would call it myopia that, to your point, is like shaping some of the decisions we're making in the short term for the right now, and not really being able to see the long game of a white nationalist movement that's growing, that doesn't want anybody who looks like you or me here in this country. And a place where none of us are safe is a place where Jews are not safe either. And so I come back to that a lot. And so even if you don't believe that your liberation is bound up in mind, like if that's not actually true in your heart, then you also have to look back at history and what it has taught us about where we are able to live and thrive freely and when we can't.
Good. Okay, so that's a good place to pause, I think. Let's invite our colleague David Zvi to bring in some questions, because we want to make this a little more interactive.
Well, first, I want to thank both of you, Justus and Ginna, for a really stimulating and really deep and really moving conversation. We've received many, many questions, so I'm going to do my best to try to bundle them, and I hope I am summarizing your thoughts correctly. And I just want to start with I think the question that was asked most often, which is about Black anti-Semitism. I think there are a number of people who are wondering specifically about Black anti-Semitism in the South. They're wondering, Ginna, whether you've experienced anti-Semitism yourself. I think there are a number of people who remember growing up in the 50s and the 60s experiencing anti-Semitism more acutely. And they also have experiences of Farrakhan, or remember hearing Farrakhan, and are trying to kind of reconcile those experiences and that with Black Lives Matter movement. So I think the first question is really, can you speak to how that question of Black anti-Semitism fits into that conversation? And I think the other part of this is also a memory of Jews feeling that they themselves are an oppressed and minority group who are also trying to navigate their own relationship to whiteness. So simple question.
One of the cool things about being a non-white Jew is that people don't suspect that I am. And if they're not Jewish and they don't know that I am from the outset, they will say the most offensive and horrible things. So yeah, I have experienced anti-Semitism, but not just from Black people, from white non-Jews, because I am able to sort of move into spaces and it not be suspected. So I would say that I've experienced anti-Semitism from all stripes of folks in all regions of the country and in all spaces, whether it be at work or at the grocery store. You know, I've seen it and I've heard it all. It's interesting, this question, particularly of anti-Semitism among the Black community, because I think I don't want to say it's a red herring, but as Justus pointed out, racism is like is just like interwoven in everything that we do. It's foundational to so many of our systems of laws and policies, and it shows up everywhere. Anti-Semitism is the type of oppression that at least in the modern application, it doesn't show up in that same way. So it's experienced differently, and I think that's important to recognize. So when we talk about Blacks who may be holding anti-Semitic beliefs or who may traffic in anti-Semitic tropes, there is an element of actual lived experience with Jews and those relationships have been fraught, and those relationships have been problematic, and those relationships, particularly, thinking about communities in Brooklyn or Baltimore, where Black folks in impoverished neighborhoods have lived in places that have been owned by Jewish property owners, right? And their experience of not having things taken care of, not having things dealt with. And like, there is a lived experience of some Black people in urban environments of not wanting to interact with the Jewish community and having interactions not be positive. Those sorts of stories exist, and there is a lived experience that contributes to, anti-Semitic ideas and beliefs. And going back to Justus's point where he was talking about that relationship between Black communities and Jewish communities not being the same as it once was, creates or removes the vehicles and avenues for conversation to educate beyond an anti-Semitic trope or a belief or an ideal. I will also point out that as a Black person, what's really interesting to me, and this is not necessarily an indictment of Black community or Black press, but it is a lot easier for me to get interest or attention, if you will, on me and my family or the Black Jewish community from Jewish publications, but Black publications and Black organizations have not really embraced the idea that not all Black people are Christian. So like we, in some ways, the Jewish community is steps ahead of the Black community in recognizing that people like me and my children exist. And so that is something that I don't want folks here to think that, I'm only about the Jews fixing ourselves, but the Black folks need to fix ourselves too and recognize that we're not monolith and we're not all the same either.
I want to add one thing. That was helpful for me, Ginna. My sense is this question about Black anti-Semitism for some, right? If we don't talk about this, address this, put this on the table, it prevents many American Jews from getting deeper into the conversation. As long as it is an actual genuine curiosity and not a talking point, then we're good. When it becomes a talking point, well, why should we be talking with Black folk because there's anti-Semitism there? Or to throw off the name Farrakhan like 2 minutes into a conversation with a Black leader when Farrakhan is not a major leader in most Black circles. We Jews have made Farrakhan a much, as long as there's curiosity and there's reason to be concerned and curious, right? There were shootings in November and December, the Monsey Hanukkah attacks that made us wonder, wait, is there some new form of anti-Semitism we had not paid attention to before that we now need to be worried about? Those are reasonable questions, I think, for us to ask. At the same time, from my watching things and listening and reading, I'm actually not seeing any kind of trend. I'm not seeing patterns that make me concerned. I would say, if anything, it's not that to the extent Black anti-Semitism exists, it probably has been worse a generation or two before. In the 1960s, you have figures like CCNY Professor Leonard Jeffries, who would give a talk about the role of Jews in the slave trade. And the Nation of Islam was publishing books with there's this whole set of stuff out there that's just weird and really problematic. Okay, that is not, that kind of stuff is not taking hold in the same way today. And to me, one of the things that gives me hope is I worried that the events of this winter we're going to prevent many American Jews from continuing to open up to movements for racial justice. And I feel like that hasn't necessarily happened at the level I feared that it would. And so that makes me hopeful.
I want to ask you another few questions, which are not exactly the same, but I think are connected. One of the questions is, a couple of people asked what the relationship is between internal Jewish conversations around Jews of color and Black Jewish relations more generally, how those two conversations connect to each other. Another person was wondering about the kind of arc of Black Jewish relations, thinking back, as I think many people do, to the famous images of Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel together, and are wondering kind of what is the future, is it possible to recreate moments like that? And then the last question somebody asked is, how does the Jewish community invest in the future of Black Jewish relations without being condescending, i.e. throwing money at it?
First of all, I don't think throwing, I think throwing money at it might be a condescending way to think about it, but I also think about it as, for lack of a better word, reparations. Like, reparations don't have to just be checks from the government. I think that we can all redistribute wealth in ways that help to equalize the very unequal ways that Black and Indigenous and Brown people have been treated in this country, and access to opportunity and progress. So I think that I'm going to say, share the money, throw the money at the problem. We can help you identify Black and Brown-led groups who've been doing this work, justice work, movement work, really trying to make real social change and really right those wrongs. That is a strategy. That is absolutely a strategy, and I do not think should be considered condescending. This question around Jews of color internal to the community and like external conversations of Jews of color, Blacks and Jews is really interesting, right? Because I remember there was an early question, like one of the very first questions in the Q&A before we really got into the conversation, that sort of pointed this out. That was like, hey, they're not two separately distinct groups when we're talking about Jews of color. And, we're talking about the Black community and the Jewish community. There is that Venn diagram. The Jews of color, I don't know how many people here or have heard of the Jews of Color Initiative, based in California, and really built up to help support the Jewish community in becoming and reflecting our full diversity. And one of the key projects that they did last year was a meta-study of Jewish population studies in the United States. And so they looked at all the data, all the times we've tried to count the Jews over the last several years, and really found that, the estimation is that Jews of color make up 12 to 15% of the American Jewish population. So what that means is that we have within our own community tremendous opportunity to have these own internal conversations. And we don't have to go very far to really address internally like racial justice and injustice within our Jewish community. I think it does beg a question a little bit around what does it mean for Jews of color? Can we, should we be any sort of bridge between these communities that we exist in racially and religiously? Is that a role we should be expected to play? We have to play. I think these are really live questions. And are Jews of color, should they be some of the vehicles for Black Jewish, again, recognizing they're not monoliths and completely separate, but for the sake of ease, we're going to keep them separate for this exercise. Is there a natural space for Jews of color to play a bridge role? Possibly, maybe. And what would that look like in terms of a burden on JOCs who are trying to fix not only their own support and visibility in Jewish community, but then now also carrying this water of trying to be the bridge? it's a great question, and I wish I had the answer right now.
Yeah, let me add a few quick comments. In terms of investing without being condescending, I like Ginna, what you said, that okay, you know, putting some muscle and some money, it's not a bad thing. I would add that, you know, we're beyond, if there was a historical moment when we could do more one-sided things, we're definitely past it now, right? Any kind of investment only happens through real partnership and through real relationship. And there are so many amazing movements that Black Americans are invested in right now, whether it's criminal justice reform or just racism or
environmental justice, reproductive
environmental justice. Thank you. So, like for me personally, I've been experimenting with testing my voice on decriminalizing marijuana. Why? Because when I saw the data for the state of New Jersey about incarceration rates for the same offense for Black folk versus white folk, I actually didn't believe the data at first. And at the same time, I felt like this is one area where a rabbinic voice might actually be useful, because we're talking about drugs and all of these other things that a clergy voice could have a role, right? So I know other Jewish funders who are really taking seriously the criminal justice reform movement and trying to find their space within it. Okay, showing up in those kind of spaces and movements, to me, is an amazing and authentic way that we can do some of this partnership. In terms of recreating the amazing moment of the civil rights movement, we're going to talk a little bit about this in our next session and get into some of the details. Maybe what I'll just say now is, we have some rose-colored glasses about what was going on in that moment, not in terms of, I think, being inspired by Jews, and in some cases Jewish institutions, who were actively involved, right? We know Jewish leaders helped literally found some of the core institutions of the civil rights movement. At the same time, these leaders in these institutions were not, right? Many know that Heschel was not beloved for his work in the moment. He was an out.
Neither was King. Neither was King.
Neither
right?
was King. Thank you. Neither was King within the Black. So it is more complicated. So I actually don't think that we need to recreate some moment like that. But I think that we can be inspired by the fact that there were Jewish leaders, Jewish institutions, and Jewish non-leaders, individuals, who were actively participating in these movements, which is also happening today. It is definitely happening today. Could it be happening a lot more? I think it could be happening a tremendous amount more.
I think we have time for just one more question. So I want to ask a question, then expand on it a little bit. Someone asked how is it possible to influence producers of Jewish curricula to include images and stories of Jews of color? But I think the kind of larger way to ask the question is, what are some practical steps that people in positions of power within Jewish communities can do, people who develop curricula, people who sit on boards? What are things that they can do right now to help advance, to promote representation of Jews of color?
I am a big fan of the PJ Library, project of the Grinspoon Foundation, and I was an early adopter, having lived in a city which was their first target market many, many years ago. And I have enjoyed, not only as a consumer of their content, enjoyed over the years watching it become more reflective, watching it become more diverse, and knowing that it actually does make a difference. And I happened to have a conversation with one of their leaders in their curriculum development work, and knowing that foundations and folks who can control and influence content are having these conversations. So it's not good enough for us to only have the conversation, at our JCC or at our board. the people who actually are paying for the books to be written and the books to be published and for the videos to be made need to be having these conversations. So to the extent that folks who have levers of influence they can pull at publishing houses, in production, in all manner of creating the images and the content that we see, take it to them. Like, again, this is an example again of using that influence and that power that we currently have as a Jewish community in the United States in 2020 to really change the game. And it matters. And so I think that first, looking at the content that you have, looking at the content that you produce, who are the people that you're speaking to, going to, and asking questions? Who are you inviting in for programming? All of these things, you know, what is your own assessment of how you're representing and reflecting your community? It starts with looking at what that looks like and then taking the steps to find out how you can change it and how much you actually need to change it.
That's great. So I know we need to close. I'll be brief. One of the things that excites me, Ginna, about this moment is that there is a greater level of institutionalization of the needs of Jews of color, you know, today than ever before. And so there are places to turn to, right, to get the poster that my shul has up that says something like "Jews come in many colors" or whatever. And
yep.
Like, the poster just needs to be up in my shul and just remind people, like, every time that they walk in, like, oh yeah, you know, there's a lot of diversity here. So I think that we actually do have access to resources. It's on us to do it. The second thing I would say is I feel like I'm living through a moment where narrative change is part of what we all have to be engaged in. So when I give a sermon or when I tell a story about our history or all of those things, we just have to make these little subtle shifts about how we tell those stories so that they are more inclusive and that they do speak to the real diversity of our lived community.
Well, I want to thank our panelists just one more time for this incredibly rich and thoughtful and important conversation. And just remind everyone that the next part of this conversation is going to be taking place basically a week from today. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you again to our panelists.
Okay, thank you, Ginna. Thank you, and for Justin behind the scenes. And thank you, everyone, for coming. We hope you'll share this with friends if you want. And see you next week if you're interested.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.